The billionaire had waited for this moment for years. Every doctor, every specialist, and every precaution had been arranged to make sure that nothing went wrong during the birth of his first child. The hospital was a quiet, private place, known for its strict security and the way it treated its patients with care. The billionaire was confident, yet deep inside, a small part of him worried. Even with all the money and influence he had, life had a way of surprising him in ways he could never expect. The day began like any other at the hospital. With doctors and nurses moving carefully through the halls, the billionaire sat in a private waiting room, pacing back and forth. He had been told it could take hours, and every minute felt like a lifetime. His heart ached with anticipation and fear. He wanted this child more than anything in the world. He had built his empire, made countless decisions, and achieved success. But now, in this quiet waiting room, none of that mattered. Only the tiny life growing inside his wife mattered. Outside, the city moved on as usual, but for him, time seemed to stop. He thought about the future, about holding his baby, about the sound of tiny cries that would bring joy into his life. He tried to imagine what the child would look like, how he would smile, or how he would take his first steps. He even imagined teaching the child simple things like reading and walking. Yet the reality of birth always carried uncertainty. Despite all precautions, there was always a risk. Inside the delivery room, everything was calm and professional. Doctors moved with precision, and nurses followed strict routines. The billionaire's wife was brave, focused, and surrounded by skilled hands. He could hear her breathing, sometimes labored, sometimes soft, but he stayed outside, unable to see every moment. The tension in the room was invisible to him, but heavy in his chest. He tried to imagine a positive outcome, a smooth birth, and a healthy baby. Finally, after hours that felt like days, the moment arrived. A cry broke the silence, and his heart leaped. He was told the baby was healthy, wrapped carefully in blankets. Relief washed over him like a tidal wave, replacing the worry that had lived in him for so long. Doctors and nurses smiled, congratulating the mother and father. The first moments were filled with joy, tears, and a sense of accomplishment. The billionaire felt a love so strong that it seemed to fill the entire room. The baby was placed in the mother's arms, tiny fingers curling around hers. It was a perfect moment, delicate and profound. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and in that shared gaze, everything else faded away. All the money, power, and success of the billionaire's life mattered less than this moment of human connection. He whispered promises he knew he might not be able to keep, vowing to protect this child no matter what. It was a promise born out of deep love, hope, and fear. But just as quickly as joy had come, an uneasy feeling settled in the room. Things moved fast, yet strangely, some details seemed off. Nurses went in and out, staff exchanged quiet words, and certain areas were off limits. The billionaire trusted the professionals, but instinct told him to watch carefully. He had spent years observing people, understanding their actions and reading situations. Something didn't feel right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Later, after the initial celebration, the baby needed to be checked, and the mother rested. The billionaire stayed close, watching over both of them. The hospital was a maze of corridors, offices, and restricted areas. Everyone had their role, and security was tight. Yet even in this controlled environment, small mistakes could happen. And the billionaire felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. Every person in the room was expected to perform perfectly, and every small detail mattered. He tried to remain calm, yet inside, he was alert, waiting for the next moment, the next sign that everything was truly safe. Hours passed and the family seemed settled. But the unexpected has a way of arriving quietly. What no one knew, not even the billionaire, was that something was about to change everything. A baby that had been so carefully brought into the world would suddenly be gone. In a blink, joy would turn into panic, and anticipation would transform into fear. It was the kind of moment that no amount of money or planning could prevent. Life had its own rules. The billionaire was about to learn them in the harshest way. The first hint came from a nurse who noticed something unusual. A routine check revealed that the baby was not where he had been placed. Confusion spread immediately. Doctors and staff searched the room, retracing every step, checking every area. Security footage was reviewed, but it was incomplete, showing gaps that made no sense. Panic began to grow, subtle at first, then stronger as the reality settled in. The billionaire was called in, his heart pounding, his mind racing. The baby, his child, had disappeared. Shock froze him for a moment. He could not speak, could not move. He thought about the promises he had whispered, the love he had felt in that fleeting moment, and now it seemed stolen from him. The hospital became a place of tension, not comfort. Staff whispered, administrators made calls, and the world outside started to notice the absence. Yet inside, the billionaire felt a deep, personal grief that no headline or media report could capture. It was intimate, raw, and suffocating. Questions flooded his mind. How could this happen in a hospital so secure? Who could take a child from one of the wealthiest people in the world? The answers were not immediately clear. Investigators were called, staff were questioned, and the hospital went into lockdown. Every detail mattered. Every person was suspect, and the billionaire felt the weight of helplessness pressing down. He had built walls, security systems, and a life of control. Yet this situation proved that no amount of power could guard against every danger. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the hospital, a poor maid quietly observed. She had been working quietly, cleaning, moving through spaces where no one else paid attention. She saw things that others overlooked, tiny details that would have seemed insignificant. A conversation overheard, a hand moving in an unusual way, a small corridor rarely used. It was nothing in isolation but pieces of a puzzle that, when put together, could reveal the truth. She did not yet realize the role she would play, but instinct told her that what she had seen was important. That quiet observation, unnoticed by the wealthy and powerful, might one day make all the difference. The billionaire did not know it yet, but his world had shifted. The life he had hoped to cradle in his arms was missing. The hospital, once a place of safety and professionalism, now felt like a maze of secrets and questions. He felt the helplessness of a parent who could not protect his own child. The public had begun to notice, and the media whispered rumors, each one a dagger to his heart. He wanted to act, to search, to find answers immediately, yet patience and careful strategy were required. Every step had to be measured, every decision weighed. And yet the emotional turmoil made reason difficult. Hours turned into a day, and the search continued. The billionaire visited every room, asked questions, and observed every staff member. But the baby was nowhere to be found. His mind raced with possibilities, from accident to deliberate crime. Fear gnawed at him, and he felt the weight of all the years he had waited for this child. The absence was not just physical, it was a void in his life, an emptiness that no amount of money or influence could fill. Friends and family offered support, yet nothing could touch the core of his grief. And all the while, the poor maid remembered. Every small action, every detail, every unusual moment of that night came back to her. She struggled with fear, knowing that speaking out could risk her job, her life, and everything she had. But she also knew that she could not ignore it forever. The baby's life depended on truth, on courage, on someone willing to step forward. Her conscience weighed heavily, but the right action was clear, even if it was difficult. In the quiet corners of the hospital, she began to plan how she could reveal what she had seen, how she could bring hope back to a father desperate to find his child in that first part of the story. The billionaire learned a painful truth. Life cannot be controlled, no matter how much power one has. Joy can turn into fear in an instant, and the smallest unnoticed detail can hold the key to salvation. The hospital, the staff, and even the richest man in the city were suddenly caught in a reality that demanded courage, patience, and human connection. And somewhere in the shadows, a humble maid held the seed of the truth that could restore hope. Even in the darkest moment of loss, days passed since the disappearance of the newborn, and the billionaire found himself trapped in a whirlwind of grief and confusion. Every waking moment was filled with thoughts of his missing child. Sleep offered little relief. as dreams only replayed the joyful first moments with his baby before twisting into scenes of absence and fear. He could not understand how something so precious could vanish in a place meant to protect life. The hospital, once a symbol of safety, now seemed cold and uncertain. A place filled with secrets that no one dared to speak aloud. Investigators had been called in, and security teams were working tirelessly. The media began to pick up the story, and while they reported it carefully, their curiosity and speculation added pressure. Reporters outside the hospital tried to capture every moment, hoping for a glimpse of the billionaire or a statement from the family. The constant attention was overwhelming, yet no one could offer answers. The missing baby was more than a news story, it was a human tragedy. Every hour that passed deepened the sense of loss. Within the hospital, tension simmered. Staff members whispered in corners, unsure of what to say or who to trust. Some feared being blamed for mistakes, while others worried about what could happen if the truth came out. Nurses who had worked for years in the hospital felt an unfamiliar unease. Sensing that their carefully controlled environment was unraveling, every routine action was now shadowed with doubt, and the smooth rhythm of hospital life had been replaced with a quiet fear that never seemed to fade. The billionaire remained at the center of this storm, determined to find answers. Despite the panic and confusion, he focused on logic and observation. He retraced every step that had been taken during the hours of the birth, examining protocols, checking access points, and questioning staff. Even the smallest inconsistency could hold a clue, and he did not allow any detail to escape his notice. His mind, trained in business and strategy, worked tirelessly, trying to make sense of what seemed impossible. Yet each step of the search also reminded him of the fragility of life and the limits of control. Meanwhile, poor Maid continued her quiet work, moving unseen through the hospital's halls. Her mind replayed every detail from the night the baby disappeared. She remembered seeing certain staff members act strangely, hearing hushed conversations, and noticing movements that did not make sense. Each memory, once insignificant, now formed a troubling pattern. She understood that her observations could make a difference, but fear kept her silent. She was poor, alone, and dependent on her work for survival. Speaking up could cost her everything. Yet staying quiet weighed heavily on her conscience. As the days continued, the billionaire's sorrow became more visible. He no longer tried to hide it from staff or family. His once calm demeanor was replaced by a restless intensity. Friends and colleagues offered support, but even their presence could not ease the pain. He spent hours walking the hospital corridors, asking questions and reviewing every report. Each new piece of information was carefully analyzed, yet every answer seemed to lead to more uncertainty. The absence of his child created a vacuum in his life, one that no amount of wealth or power could fill. The hospital administration grew anxious. They conducted their own internal reviews, attempting to account for every action taken on the day of the birth. Security footage was examined repeatedly, but gaps remained, raising more questions than answers. Staff were interviewed multiple times, and tensions rose as suspicions spread like wildfire. The fear of consequences made people defensive, and trust became fragile. Even those who had nothing to hide felt the weight of the situation pressing down on them. The environment, once orderly and predictable, now felt like a maze where every corner held a potential secret. The poor maid could not stop thinking about what she had seen. Every time she moved through the hospital, her eyes scanned for anything unusual. She noticed small things: a door left slightly open, a room that seemed off limits, a conversation that ended abruptly when she entered. These small observations gnawed at her, forming a picture she dared not fully assemble in her mind. She understood that something serious had occurred, something that could not be fixed with money or influence. The realization created a sense of responsibility she could not ignore. Late at night, when the hospital was quiet and most staff had left, the maid reflected on the weight of truth. She knew she had to act carefully. Rushing or revealing information without proof could backfire. Yet, waiting too long could endanger the child further. The balance between caution and urgency was delicate, and she struggled to find the courage to take the right step. Her situation reminded her of her own vulnerability, and the thought of being dismissed or punished for speaking out was terrifying. Still, the thought of the missing baby, alone and unprotected, propelled her forward. The billionaire, aware that conventional search methods were failing, began exploring every possible lead. He contacted private investigators, security experts, and even individuals known for finding people who had vanished under strange circumstances. His determination was unwavering. He could not accept that the child he had longed for, the life he had dreamed of holding, could simply disappear. Each lead, no matter how small, was pursued relentlessly, but frustration grew as dead ends appeared. It became clear that the solution would require more than resources. It would require insight, attention to detail, and perhaps someone willing to speak the truth no one else would. Days turned into a week, and the stress weighed heavily on everyone involved. Staff worked under increased scrutiny, investigators pressed for answers, and the billionaire faced a constant emotional strain. The hospital became a place of quiet tension, where every step was calculated and every word was measured. Even those who had initially tried to avoid involvement found themselves drawn into the investigation. No one could remain neutral. The stakes were too high and the consequences too serious. In the midst of this, the maid made a decision. She could not continue to watch from the sidelines. She began to gather her observations, writing them down in a small notebook she kept hidden. Each note was precise, detailing what she had seen, heard, and remembered. She tried to remain objective, recording facts without interpretation, understanding that the truth would speak for itself. The act of writing gave her a sense of control, a way to contribute to the search without immediately exposing herself. It was a small step, but one that carried significant weight. At the same time, the billionaire continued to grapple with conflicting emotions. Anger, grief, hope, and despair collided within him. He had always believed that money and power could solve problems. But now he faced a situation where neither could provide answers. He realized that human action, observation, and courage were as important as any material resource. The absence of his child had revealed the limits of influence, and in doing so, highlighted the importance of honesty, empathy, and careful attention to the small details often overlooked. The media continued to report cautiously, respecting the family's privacy, but unable to resist the intrigue of the story. Rumors circulated, each adding pressure to the situation. Public interest brought attention to the hospital, the billionaire, and the missing child. While this attention was largely unwelcome, it also created an opportunity. Every person who might have information became a potential source, and every observer, including the maid, knew that speaking up could bring the truth to light. The story was no longer just a private tragedy. It had become a test of courage, integrity, and human connection. Through it all, the maid remained vigilant. She continued her daily tasks, blending into the background, while secretly piecing together what she had witnessed. She became increasingly aware of the significance of her role. The baby's safety, the truth about the disappearance, and the possibility of reunion rested on her willingness to act. Fear remained, but determination grew stronger. She understood that timing, discretion, and clarity were essential, and that one wrong move could endanger everything. Yet, the moral weight of the situation compelled her forward. Meanwhile, the billionaire prepared for every possibility. He reviewed security logs, considered every scenario, and analyzed behavior patterns of everyone involved. He understood that finding the baby required more than searching. It required insight into human behavior and observation of small, seemingly insignificant details. His approach combined patience, strategy, and relentless attention, reflecting his understanding that life, unlike business, often defied logic and expectation. As the second part of the story unfolded, the tension grew. The hospital, once orderly and predictable, had become a place of uncertainty. The billionaire, consumed by love and fear, sought answers tirelessly. The maid, quiet but observant, gathered the pieces of a hidden puzzle. The interplay of courage, morality, and vigilance set the stage for the revelation that could change everything. The days of uncertainty, fear, and quiet observation were leading toward a moment where hidden truths would surface. and the fate of the missing newborn could finally be revealed. The days after the disappearance of the newborn were heavy and full of tension. The billionaire could no longer focus on anything else. His work, his meetings, even simple conversations seemed distant compared to the thought of his missing child. Every sound, every phone call, every knock at the door made him jump. He felt like his world had shifted, like he was walking through a fog where nothing felt certain. People around him noticed the change. He was no longer the calm, composed figure who handled everything with confidence. Grief and worry had taken over, and there was no escape from the constant question: where was his baby? Within the hospital, the atmosphere was thick with unease. Staff moved cautiously, speaking in hushed tones, always aware that the billionaire's gaze could fall on them at any moment. Administrators tried to maintain order, but the tension made every step feel fragile. Investigators worked methodically, checking logs, interviewing staff, and retracing every detail from the day of the birth. Every small inconsistency was noted, every deviation from protocol carefully examined. The hospital, once a place of routine, had become a labyrinth of suspicion and fear. The poor maid continued her quiet, careful observation. She remembered every detail from the night the baby disappeared. The way certain staff members moved, the rooms that were briefly opened and closed, the conversations that ended suddenly when she approached. Each memory was stored carefully in her mind, a record she could rely on when the time was right. Fear still gripped her, but she could no longer ignore what she had seen. She felt a responsibility to act, though she did not yet know how. The weight of the truth pressed on her, and she knew that it could not be kept hidden forever at night. When the hospital was quiet, she reflected on what had happened. The baby, innocent and defenseless, was out there somewhere, and time was precious. Every moment of delay could put the child in danger. She understood the stakes. The thought of the missing baby filled her with both fear and determination. She began to plan carefully, thinking about how to reveal what she knew without putting herself at immediate risk. The balance between caution and action was delicate, but she knew it had to be done. The baby's life depended on it. The billionaire, meanwhile, was consumed by the same questions. How could this happen? Who could have taken the child? And why? He spent hours going over every detail he could recall. Even small, seemingly unimportant moments were analyzed over and over in his mind. He reached out to everyone involved, checked every report, and considered every possible scenario. He knew that the answer would not come easily. This was not a situation that could be solved with money alone. It required observation, patience, and understanding human behavior in ways that even his wealth could not buy. As the days went by, tension in the hospital grew. Staff felt the pressure of constant scrutiny. Each person feared making a mistake or saying the wrong thing. Even those who were innocent worried, and the feeling of suspicion hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Investigators pressed for details, asking the same questions again and again. Security footage was reviewed repeatedly, but gaps and inconsistencies made the search even more difficult. The hospital, once a place of care and order, had become a place of uncertainty and anxiety. The maid continued to watch and wait. She moved through the hospital quietly, unnoticed, observing small details that others overlooked. She saw the nervous glances, the quick movements, the hushed conversations. She kept track of everything, recording her observations in a small notebook she kept hidden. Each entry was precise and factual, avoiding speculation or assumptions. She knew that clarity and accuracy were essential. One wrong detail could compromise the search for the baby or put her at risk. She took her role seriously, understanding that she was now part of something far greater than herself. During this time, the billionaire's grief deepened, but so did his resolve. He realized that he could not simply wait for answers. He had to actively seek them. He expanded the search, hiring private investigators who specialized in missing persons and unusual cases. Every lead was pursued with meticulous care. He reviewed every detail, every movement of staff, every protocol, and every possible angle that could explain the disappearance. The search required patience and endurance, but he was determined. He would not rest until his child was found. As the investigation continued, the maid began to piece together the story in her mind. She remembered the way certain staff had acted unusually on the night of the birth. She recalled hearing fragments of conversation that hinted at something more than an accident. She began to see a pattern that suggested the baby had been deliberately moved, perhaps to hide a mistake or a secret. Her fear was strong, but it was now matched by a sense of moral duty. She could not remain silent any longer. The truth, she realized, needed to be revealed if the baby was to be found. Despite the fear that gripped her, she began to consider how she could safely come forward. She knew that approaching the wrong person could endanger her and the child. She needed someone who would listen, someone who could act on the information without hesitation. She spent nights planning her next steps, weighing each possibility carefully. Her courage grew, fueled by the thought of the baby who was out there alone. She knew that her actions could change the course of events and perhaps save the child. The billionaire, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly aware that conventional methods might not be enough. He understood that resources and power had limits. What he needed now was insight, observation, and perhaps the courage of someone willing to reveal what had been hidden. He reflected on his own life and career, realizing that despite all his achievements, he was now dependent on human honesty and vigilance more than anything else. The absence of his child had stripped away the illusions of control and revealed the fundamental importance of truth and courage. As the days turned into a week, the tension reached its peak. Investigators had interviewed staff multiple times, but no clear answers emerged. Security footage was incomplete, leaving gaps that only added to the confusion. The hospital's administration was under pressure, and staff were anxious, unsure of who could be trusted. The billionaire remained focused, analyzing every lead and every action, refusing to give up hope. He knew that the solution would not come easily, but he also understood that the answer was out there, waiting to be found. The maid, quietly and methodically, continued to gather evidence. She recorded every observation, every unusual action, every fragment of conversation. Her notebook became a careful record, one that could guide the investigation if shared with the right person. She understood the power of her knowledge and the responsibility that came with it. Every detail mattered, and she knew that one small revelation could bring the entire situation into focus. She prepared herself for the moment when she would finally step forward, knowing that courage was necessary to bring the truth to light. Meanwhile, the billionaire's life outside the hospital had changed completely. Meetings, public appearances, and daily routines were overshadowed by the search for his child. He spoke less, observed more, and relied on his instincts to navigate a situation that no wealth could control. Every decision, every conversation, every observation was now influenced by the ongoing investigation. He understood that the search was not just about resources. It was about patience, insight, and the human ability to recognize truth. The tension, fear, and uncertainty in the hospital created an atmosphere where every detail mattered. Staff were cautious, investigators persistent, and the billionaire vigilant. The maid, moving quietly through this environment, held a secret that could change everything. Her courage, her observation, and her careful planning had become essential components of the unfolding story. The stage was set for a revelation that could restore hope and bring the missing newborn back to the arms of the father who had waited so long. Every moment of observation, every careful decision, and every act of courage was building toward a turning point where the hidden truth would finally emerge. Days turned into weeks, and the search for the missing newborn seemed endless. The billionaire was more determined than ever, though each day without answers weighed heavily on him. Sleep became rare, meals were often forgotten, and every waking moment was consumed by thoughts of the child. He felt powerless, frustrated, and desperate, yet he never allowed himself to give up. The love he felt for the baby was stronger than fear, doubt, or exhaustion, and it kept him moving forward. Inside the hospital, tension remained high. Staff members moved cautiously, aware that investigators were reviewing every detail and that the billionaire's eyes were always observing. Security cameras had gaps. Hospital logs were incomplete, and every person involved in the birth was under scrutiny. The administration tried to maintain calm, but uncertainty filled the air. Everyone knew that mistakes had been made, or at least that something unusual had occurred. But no one yet understood the full picture. Each day brought new questions and very few answers. The poor maid continued to play her quiet role. She had watched, remembered, and recorded everything from the night the baby disappeared. Her notebook was filled with observations: who went where, what was said, and what seemed out of place. She now realized that these small details could become the key to solving the mystery. Her fear was still present, but it had been joined by a sense of responsibility and courage. She understood that the baby's safety might depend entirely on her willingness to speak up at the right moment. She began thinking carefully about how to come forward. She knew she needed to choose someone she could trust completely. One wrong person, one careless word could jeopardize everything. Nights were spent planning, rethinking, and rehearsing how to explain the details she had observed. She reminded herself to focus only on facts, to avoid speculation, and to trust that truth could guide action. Every small movement, every detail she remembered, became part of a careful strategy. Meanwhile, the billionaire was trying to piece together the limited information available. Investigators had checked every possible lead, but results were inconclusive. Staff interviews provided minor details, but no one seemed willing to give the full truth. He began to feel that the missing piece of the puzzle might come from someone who had quietly observed the events. He thought about all the people who had been present during the birth, considering who might have noticed something unusual. His intuition told him that someone, even a seemingly insignificant staff member, could hold the key. The hospital had become a place of both fear and vigilance. Staff walked on eggshells, not knowing which question might trigger consequences. Nurses and assistants were more careful than ever. Security personnel scrutinized every movement, and investigators were relentless. Yet even in this controlled chaos, the poor maid moved carefully, unnoticed, recording every detail that could help. She understood that timing, courage, and careful observation were all critical. The truth could no longer be hidden if she wanted the baby to be found. One evening, after the hospital was mostly empty, the maid decided it was time to act. She had gathered enough details and knew that delay could be dangerous for the child. She approached a trusted investigator, someone who had shown integrity and concern for the child's safety. Her voice was quiet but firm as she recounted what she had seen. She described every movement, every conversation, every unusual action from the night of the birth. She focused on the facts, avoiding assumptions or speculation. Letting the evidence speak for itself, the investigator listened carefully, asking questions to clarify details, verifying each piece of information. The maid's account filled in gaps that had puzzled investigators for weeks. Slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge. The baby had not simply disappeared. There were deliberate actions that had moved the child away from the hospital. Actions that had been hidden behind routines and official procedures. The evidence suggested that someone had wanted the baby to be lost, to disappear from sight, but had left small traces that only a careful observer could notice. The realization was both shocking and relieving. Investigators now had a lead based on actual observations, a way to follow the path the baby had taken. Plans were immediately made to trace every possible route, check every location, and verify every detail. The hospital staff were informed carefully, security protocols were re-examined, and coordination began with law enforcement. What had been a puzzle with many unknowns was slowly taking the shape of a solution. The poor maid's courage had created a breakthrough, and the missing baby's path was finally becoming clear. The billionaire was informed about the new developments. He felt a rush of hope and disbelief. After weeks of despair, he was told that a crucial witness had come forward with detailed observations. The thought that his child might still be found filled him with renewed energy. He immediately became involved, working closely with investigators to follow up on the leads provided by the maid. Every detail was scrutinized, every step carefully planned. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to imagine holding the baby again. Investigators moved quickly. The trail was painstaking, but each step brought them closer to the truth. Locations were checked, witnesses were interviewed, and timelines were reconstructed based on the maid's observations. The process required patience, care and attention to detail. The baby's safety was the priority, and every decision was made with caution and urgency. Slowly but surely, the plan began to take shape, and the likelihood of a reunion increased with each passing hour. The maid watched from a distance, quietly observing the progress she had set in motion. She felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief that action was finally being taken, anxiety that the process still carried risks. She understood that the baby was still vulnerable, and that mistakes could still happen. But for the first time, she saw hope taking root. Her observations, once unnoticed and hidden, were now the key to bringing the child home. The billionaire spent long hours working with investigators. He revisited hospital logs, analyzed security footage, and examined every detail provided by the maid. Each discovery added clarity to the situation, and he felt a growing sense of control and optimism. While the weeks of uncertainty had been agonizing, he now saw a path forward. His love for the child, combined with careful planning and collaboration, was beginning to turn despair into hope. Plans were put in place to recover the baby safely. Law enforcement coordinated with private investigators, hospitals, and other relevant authorities. Every potential location was identified and checked. Care was taken to ensure that the child would be protected once found, and that no further harm could come from the actions of those responsible. The operation was delicate, requiring patience and precision, but the groundwork laid by the maid's observations made it possible as the search progressed. The maid continued her daily work, quietly moving through the hospital, always alert. She remained unseen, but every day she felt a growing sense of purpose. Her courage had already made a difference, and she knew that patience and careful observation were still needed. The baby's safety depended on continued vigilance, and she was committed to doing everything possible to ensure a positive outcome. Finally, after careful investigation, coordination, and verification, the truth began to emerge fully. The baby had been moved deliberately, hidden by those seeking to cover up their actions. Every detail of the plan, from the initial concealment to the movement of the child, became clear. Investigators now had the information needed to act decisively. The mystery that had caused so much pain was no longer a collection of unknowns. It was a solvable situation, and the path to reunion was opening. The billionaire was prepared to act immediately. He understood the risks and took every precaution, but his priority was simple: to be reunited with his child. The investigation, led by careful planning, observation, and the maid's courageous testimony, had reached a point where action could finally be taken. The sense of hope that had been missing for so long returned with force. Each step forward, guided by the truth, brought him closer to the moment he had longed for since the day of the birth: the revelation of the truth. The careful planning and the courage of a single, observant maid had changed the course of events. What had begun as a heartbreaking disappearance was now on the path to resolution. Every careful observation, every moment of courage, and every step taken with patience and integrity had made it possible to bring the missing child back. The story that had been filled with fear and uncertainty was now moving toward hope, reunion, and justice. Finally, the moment that had been long awaited arrived. Weeks of uncertainty, fear, and careful observation were coming to an end. The investigators, guided by the meticulous notes and observations of the poor maid, had traced the path of the missing baby. Every detail was checked and verified, leaving no room for error. The location where the child had been hidden was secured, and a plan was made to ensure that the baby would be brought back safely. The billionaire, exhausted and anxious, waited with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The operation began with quiet precision. Investigators and law enforcement approached the location carefully, ensuring that no one could interfere. The baby, unaware of the chaos that had surrounded the past weeks, was safe and unharmed. The anticipation was palpable, and every step was measured. Those involved knew the importance of timing and coordination. This was not just about recovering a missing child. It was about restoring hope and bringing a family back together. When the billionaire first saw his baby again, emotions overwhelmed him. Months of fear and anxiety were replaced with tears of relief and joy. He held the child gently, as if afraid that any sudden movement might undo the miracle of reunion. Every emotion he had felt during the weeks of uncertainty came rushing to the surface. Relief, gratitude, and a deep, profound sense of connection. The child's small fingers clutched at him, and he realized that the bond he had imagined before the birth had been strengthened by the trials they had endured. The mother, equally relieved, embraced her child with tears streaming down her face. The hospital room, once filled with tension and fear, now held a quiet, profound joy. Staff, investigators, and the maid watched from a distance, sharing in the relief of a moment they had worked so hard to make possible. The sense of unity, courage, and dedication that had guided the investigation now culminated in a scene of human connection that could not be measured in words. The maid, who had quietly observed and recorded everything, felt a mix of relief and pride. Her courage and attention to detail had been instrumental in the recovery. She had acted carefully, methodically, and with moral clarity, and her actions had brought a child back to safety. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel recognized, knowing that her role, though quiet, had changed the course of events. The power of careful observation and moral courage had been proven, and her life, too, was forever altered by this experience. Authorities took immediate steps to ensure justice. Those responsible for hiding the baby were identified and faced the consequences of their actions. Hospital procedures were reviewed and revised to prevent such events in the future. The billionaire, though filled with relief at being reunited with his child, understood the importance of accountability. He worked closely with investigators to ensure that lessons were learned, that protocols were strengthened, and that trust could be restored within the hospital and the broader community. The days following the reunion were filled with adjustments and healing. The family slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, though the memory of the past weeks remained vivid. Every smile, every gentle touch, and every moment of quiet care held new significance. The billionaire, once consumed by fear and anxiety, now focused on nurturing the child, appreciating the fragility and preciousness of life. Each day became an opportunity to rebuild a sense of security, love, and connection that had been threatened but never broken. The maid was offered support and recognition for her bravery. While her actions had initially been quiet and unnoticed, they now became known to those who mattered most. She was given opportunities to improve her life, access to security, and acknowledgement for the courage and integrity she had shown. The act of speaking the truth, even in the face of fear, had created a ripple effect that changed the lives of everyone involved. The billionaire also took steps to improve the hospital and ensure that no child would face such danger again. Policies were strengthened, security measures improved, and training provided to staff. The lessons learned from the ordeal were transformed into practical changes that could protect future families. The story, once filled with fear and uncertainty, became an example of how vigilance, courage, and moral action could restore safety and trust. Throughout this time, the family slowly healed. The bond between parent and child grew stronger, nurtured by the trials they had faced together. The experience had shown the billionaire the limits of control, the importance of human integrity, and the irreplaceable value of observation, care, and courage. Every small action, every careful decision, and every moment of moral clarity had contributed to the final reunion. Life, with all its unpredictability, had been guided back toward hope and resolution. The maid continued to work quietly, her life now carrying a new sense of purpose. She had witnessed the fragility of life, the strength of human courage, and the profound impact of integrity. Her actions had proven that even the quietest, least powerful voices could make a monumental difference. The story, once filled with fear, is now a testament to the resilience of human spirit and the power of truth. The billionaire, holding his child close, reflected on the journey they had all endured. The weeks of uncertainty, fear, and relentless search had been painful, but they had also revealed the strength of human connection, the importance of courage, and the value of those who act with integrity even when unseen. He knew that life would continue with its challenges, but the reunion had restored a sense of hope and purpose that could never be taken away. In the end, The story was one of restoration, courage, and human triumph. The baby was safe, the family reunited, and justice had been served. The hospital had learned vital lessons, and the maid's courage had been recognized and rewarded. The billionaire's world, once shadowed by fear and uncertainty, now shone with the light of hope, love, and gratitude. The human connections, moral courage, and careful actions of those involved had transformed a heartbreaking loss into a story of resilience and reunion. The experience left a lasting impression on everyone involved. The billionaire never forgot the quiet courage of the maid, the diligence of investigators, or the dedication of hospital staff who acted with integrity despite fear. Every moment of care, attention, and moral clarity had made the difference. Life had tested them all, but the story ended with healing, recognition, and the enduring power of love and truth. It became a reminder that even in the darkest moments, courage, honesty, and human connection could bring light, hope, and the restoration of what seemed lost forever.